Hi, I'm Janice.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So today we're going to talk about one of our very favorite subjects. It's the one that got us started in our conversations, the link between UAP and consciousness. But before we do, we want to talk a little bit about a focus group that we both participated in this morning linked to the role that AI could play in social and individual well-being. Darren, you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is it was an interesting opportunity, and it was a byproduct of the fruit of our podcast, because as it turned out, some people who are doing some research into this, someone working on their dissertation to do with this overarching topic, came across our podcast, really liked what we were saying about AI, and as you discussed, how it can benefit humanity, but can also be something that could set us off track in a pretty challenging way. So it was really interesting to join together with a few other people and entertain some of these questions. It was interesting to hear the kind of questions other people were entertaining and engaging with. As is often the case, you and I ended up expanding the conversation, taking the sort of 30,000-foot view and asking some even deeper questions, more overarching questions, where we have to think about who we are, what is the nature of reality, before we can really even dive into what AI is. And that begins with asking questions such as, what actually is intelligence, if we're going to talk about what is artificial intelligence, and what does it mean to be conscious, and what is consciousness? And that relates to some of the things we're going to talk about today. But what did you think about the meeting?
Yeah, I really loved it, partly because it was an outgrowth of this podcast, as well as some of the work I was doing academically prior to this. And because of the conversation that I've been having with the person who held the focus groups, I became aware that a lot of what is starting to be discussed, at least in the worlds that she's reading about and talking about, very much lead down the path to the tighter link between technology and biology. So she, for example, pointed me to the work of Natasha Myers, who created a term called planthropocene. In her words, it's a way to affirmatively describe the possibility that lies in the relationship between humans and the natural world if they continue to support life on this planet using technology as sort of an interface, which of course made me think about some of the stories that you and I are both aware of linked to unidentified anomalous phenomena, and the craft in particular being both biological and technological, and having the occupants of the craft, for example, be able to navigate using consciousness interfaces with their craft. So those conversations like, ooh, maybe this is the beginning of that process here on this planet for us. So I thought that was great. And I feel like we're asking the right questions at this point. I mean, it would be great if we were asking them several decades ago around what's ethical, how can technology be used to support life and not just be developed because we can imagine it. So anyway, and it was fun to do with you. I think it's one of the first things that we've done together in that way.
Very true. It was fun. And like you say, it was fascinating to see the first outgrowth of the conversations that we began privately and then became this podcast. And now we're seeing it begin to reach others and foster new conversations. And we're looking forward to more of that happening moving forward.
Right. So we decided to dedicate this entire podcast to the link between UAP and consciousness, because it really is where we started our conversation. And even more importantly, it's where we each have stories that link the two in unique ways. So let me start off with our first question, which is the broadest, and that is sort of what is the link from each of our perspectives between UAP and consciousness? I think we agreed that we probably need to talk a little bit about what consciousness is, because as it turns out, as you can imagine, listeners, there's no universally accepted definition. In general, the quality of consciousness that everybody seems to agree on is that it's the state of being aware, especially of something within oneself. It's often characterized by sensation, emotion, volition, and thought. These are the things that we can't replicate technologically very easily, which is one of the reasons that it's causing us to really stop and think about, well, really, what is it that we are? What is it that we're doing? And there's some pretty interesting similarities and differences. So, for example, a lot of the Western psychology and science, or Western philosophy and science, sees consciousness as the subjective first-person experience of awareness and qualia, which is the felt quality of experiences, that gives individuals the ability to access information that we need for reasoning, decision-making, processing, and integration, as well as sort of verbal report back. Western philosophers and scientists tend to see it as an emergent property of complex neural networks in the brain. And that is clearly one of the big departure points for the Eastern traditions, which will describe it in some similar ways, but they tend to think of it as something that transcends the human brain, that transcends the human experience, that is often an aspect of everything. Consciousness in those philosophies is conceptualized as giving rise to everything, including the brain, but not limited to that. And therefore, its locus is sort of outside of the brain. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think one question is often around this particular topic is, what does it feel like to be something or another? So when we ask the question, is a rock conscious? You might begin by saying, what is it like to be a rock? What is it like to have the experience of being a rock? And we might ask that of AI or a computer. Can a computer have a felt sense of self-awareness? It's an interesting question. And like you said, there is no universally agreed upon definition. And that's part of the reason why this is a really tricky topic. And even I know Bernardo Kastrup has talked about this because he sees people being very fast and loose with some of these terms. And he actually sees physicalists sometimes looking like they're being a bit disingenuous in some debates because they'll use a term in a certain way when it supports one part of their argument. But when they get to the tricky part of the hard problem of consciousness, for instance, which is the question around how is it that physical structures in the brain give rise to conscious experience and the feeling of being a human, because that gets tricky, they then switch up for other terms where they use the same terms, but they use them as pointers pointing to something else. And they get very wordy about it, and it sounds like they're saying something coherent, but when you really look at the terms they're using and look for consistency, you find there's not consistency, and to some degree there's this kind of circular reasoning where, again, a lot of it comes down to faith statements. They just assume that consciousness must arise from these physical structures because they're really doubled down on the notion that physicality, matter, stuff is what's primary. But as you pointed to, from Eastern traditions, it's completely the other way around, that consciousness is the bedrock that gives rise to the appearance of stuff and material. Because even there, of course, the trick is whenever we're measuring things, even through the scientific method, and looking at things that seem objective and independent of us, that's still happening through our conscious experience, just like the objects of our dream states are coming through our conscious experience. We wouldn't say they have independent existence outside of our dream state and what's being produced from our consciousness. And yet we do somehow believe that about the waking world. So again, there's some inconsistency in terms of how we talk about these things. And when you really dive into it, and people like Bernardo Kastrup have done a great job here, it's really hard to argue with a notion like idealism, where you just say everything is consciousness, everything is just different modulations of consciousness. And of course, that relates to our topic today, UAP, because questions around who these beings are, where they're coming from, how they seem to pop in between these different sort of modes of being and consciousness and reality is one of the most overarchingly interesting questions. And I think this consciousness piece can help us answer some of those questions.
I don't want to take us too far down this road, but, I know we were both recently reading work on monism, right? And idealism as a component of monism. And it made me think about even just what you said related to the felt experience of. Bernardo talks a lot about it's like. But in that way of thinking, even things that may not have a felt experience of, or that we can't know has a felt experience of because we're limited by the apparatus, the physical apparatus we have to perceive, are a function of consciousness. So there's basically nothing here, innate or not, that isn't consciousness. I think as we go further down this road, as we become more versed in parsing out all these different pieces, we'll probably have to have a much more nuanced language than we have now. We'll save that for another time. And I want to start in on, how would you answer this question, Darren? What is, for you, the relationship? And sort of how did you get to this convergence of consciousness and UAP?
Well, my particular journey to this particular convergence, I would answer a couple different ways. On the one hand, I reflect on the fact that I started this little podcast on the side, and it was mainly focused on UFOs. But of course, I already knew about the overlap, the convergence between some of the data coming from that field and also near-death experience, out-of-body experience, encounters with apparitions, encounters with deceased loved ones. There are different kinds of modalities, these non-ordinary state experiences, they're all pointing in the same direction. But for me, I started with starting this podcast, discussing these kinds of matters. And really, I was bringing in my interest in consciousness, which predated and preceded my interest in UAP. But because for me, there was a natural linking up of these two, I began to talk a lot about it. And then I found, to my surprise, and it was a pleasant surprise, that many, many people within my audience, a huge percentage, actually also were on that same journey. That for many of them, unlike me, UAP had become the primary driving factor towards these overarching questions about consciousness. Because again, what happens with this is we begin with questions around nuts and bolts craft, technological kind of matters, sci-fi kind of matters, these beings that might be coming from distant star systems to study us as part of some sort of scientific expedition. But then when you really dive into it, you start finding that they can alter perception. They seem to even be able to play with our consciousness, which then highlights the fact that consciousness might not be what we think it is. There are things that happen, for instance, where people sometimes are abducted from their homes onto a craft. Other times they are taken, but only their consciousness, quote unquote, whatever that represents, goes to the craft while their body stays lying in their bed at home. So clearly these beings seem to be able to understand and operate with consciousness in a much more nuanced way than we can. So when you just look at this data, inevitably it ends up asking questions about consciousness, because all of the big questions get asked here, because these domains that we think are distinct and independent, even domains like living and dead, get traversed by these beings in the way that they interact with us, and sometimes showing up with our deceased loved ones right alongside them. So this inevitably leads to questions about consciousness, and I find that many, many people have taken that journey through this route of UAP.
I'll never forget the first conversation we had. What did we talk for, like 4 hours? It was a long time, and there was a lot for us to talk about in this domain because we were both sort of uniquely interested in consciousness. Your podcasts and your trainings have really attracted the subset of people that seem to really see these things as linked. But as you know, there are a lot of people in the UAP world, especially when they first get going, that don't see the link between the two. For me, consciousness predated not my interest in UAP because I never doubted it. Not a single day in my life that I doubted it was true. It just didn't feel relevant for a really long time. But I can't remember a time that I wasn't deeply drawn to divinity in one form or another. Like I had an early fascination with Jesus Christ, not a fascination with religion though. That felt not wrong, but non-resonant to me. Whereas I had all these transcendent experiences as a child. And as I grew, I read everything I could get my hands on that linked to it. I was just naturally drawn to things on parapsychology and Carillion photography and all the books by Richard Bach and Carlos Castaneda. And I totally remember when Shirley MacLaine, Out on a Limb, came out. I was so amazed that somebody with her stature had the bravery to write such a thing. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And then, as you know, we all grew up with Star Trek and Star Wars and all the movies that were mystical and magical. And I read everything in high school I could get my hands on related to science fiction and fantasy. I have to be honest in saying I was more attracted to fantasy than science fiction. It got kind of techie. And the techie angle of things, while I completely see the intersection now with that piece, that wasn't my favorite part. The favorite part was the magical. The ways in which, when we were talking about multiple dimensions and the ways that people could bend time and transform experiences, metamorphoses and that sort of thing. Even as a teen, I remember knowing death wasn't real. It was a shift in perspective, and I knew that this whole reality wasn't totally real, and in fact, it made it a little bit tricky to try to get interested and stay engaged here. I remember grappling with that deeply when I was a teenager. I'm like, how am I going to do this? It's just hard to stay interested. And as I grew, I figured out ways to do that, and I'm glad, and it really wasn't too hard, and there's lots here that's really fun. But I was always attracted to things that we now recognize as very adjacent to this topic, like quantum physics, parapsychology. I mean, my entire professional career has dealt with things next to it, like I started out with sex and sexuality, and then I moved to self-injury and suicide, all the things that are kind of raw. And then I think, like many of us who've been on this path, there were just knowings that have continued to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So I then learned how to separate my rational mind from my knowing mind, but it took a while. I don't know if you've had this experience, but there was a period, maybe 20 years ago, I realized whenever I met somebody, I was looking for something. Like, what am I looking for? And now I know I'm looking for, are they aware? How conscious are they? How much do they remember? You and I have had these conversations. For me, a lot of this conversation around consciousness isn't acquisition of new knowledge. I know it feels that way, but for me, it feels like remembering what I know when I'm not here. And more, and part of what makes this time so unique, and I will get here in a minute, more and more of that remembrance has become available over especially the past several years. It feels like it's speeding up. And there'll literally be moments I'm walking or in my car and I go, oh yeah, like I'll remember this piece of like putting together. It's like originally just having 10 pieces of a 100-piece puzzle, and now I feel like I have 50 or 60, and now it's starting to kind of come together. The other piece about it that made it so important and that's dovetailed with UAP was realizing how afraid we all were. At some point in my life, I must have been close to 40, and I looked around and I'm like, wow, we craft our life in response to fear more than anything else. Like I looked at the structure of my life and, some of it was definitely where I'd wanted to go and it was all good, but I couldn't believe how much of my life was sculpted in response to what I was hoping to avoid. And then because I was dealing stuff in mental health and that sort of thing, I started to realize how that was shaping everybody's lives and how much power that seemed to take away from all of us. And that was when I began, this big spiritual journey and went into the Eastern traditions and started all those practices. And I started to understand that the practices aren't just to reduce stress. They're to steady mind and create a physical conduit that can allow the energy to come in so that you can expand remembrance and knowing.
Knowing that we were going to discuss this on this week's podcast, I gave some thought to my interaction with this question around consciousness throughout my life. And of course, one thing that's always interesting about any of these topics is that the longer you live, the more you realize that everything has significance in your past, that things that seemed random and meandering and purposeless in some ways were never that way. And actually, you start recognizing that even meandering parts of the path connect to other parts of the path in significant ways that help you become who you are today, almost like breadcrumbs that are left along the trail, which relates to what you were saying about remembering. I think that's not just a random process that we just hope for the best that we will remember, but it's an interactive process with life itself. Again, getting back to the fact that everything is ultimately consciousness, that signposts are left along the way that are meant to remind us. And I often, like you were talking about, will not only track when I meet people, how awake are they, how much do they remember, but I'll also drop certain nuggets into the conversation and see how they respond to that. What kind of remembrances does that provoke in them? And that helps with that. And of course, one of the interesting aspects of that is meeting people like when you and I met and feeling like this sense of familiarity, that somehow we are kin, that we somehow were connected in some journey before we ever came into this incarnation, let alone when we met decades later. Another part for me that was fascinating is I completely agree with you that I've also always been interested in spirituality, I guess is the term to use. Consciousness is kind of a word we use more now. But I was always interested in the biggest questions. And I remember even my mom saying that when I was a little kid, I would just sit outside staring up at the stars. Even sometimes when other people were doing busy things, playing with trucks and cars and blocks, I was deep in thought often. And she had the sense at first, this is not quite normal. But actually, it was just the way that I entertained questions, even at a really young age, asking the largest questions. And then that prompted me going through kind of an experience as a Christian and going through sort of several incarnations there, or several iterations there. An evangelical Christian, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, a Pentecostal Christian, some blend of all three, and eventually ending up more like a mystical Christian and encountering the works of people like Thomas Merton. And he, of course, in his journey, found this link up with Zen and Buddhism through his journey as a mystical Christian. And that became the bridge for me as well, to go into these Eastern ways of looking at the world and reality that you already mentioned, that we've mentioned to some degree. And that was a really seamless transition for me. And then I really felt like I had the best of both worlds. The East and the West came together. But I also found that a really rigid view of reality based on scripture or based on certain dogmatic principles was too narrow for me, too limiting. Didn't feel like it did justice to the aliveness of the cosmos that I felt. That was deeply meaningful, but also very much shifting and moving and in real time interacting with me. So there was a brief period where I was kind of lost, not fully lost, but just not quite sure where I fit. Then I came across Integral Theory and Ken Wilber's work, And that really helped me even more to join together the best of Western thinking and modern science and psychology and developmental psychology with some of these ancient Eastern traditions and what they recognized about the underpinning of reality itself. And then, as you and I have talked about in previous episodes, then you start finding quantum mechanics, finding some of the same revelations that point to those same sort of fundamental principles about the nature of reality. So that was my background prior to ever getting in to UAP specifically, which leads us to our next question, which is, Janice, how did you end up on this exploration of UAP specifically, and how did it sync up with previous aspects of your journey?
Oh, I love this question because it's such an interesting part of the story. I got to say, the consciousness, interest in consciousness, and some of the things I just talked about have been there from the beginning. As I said, I never doubted the UAP were real, but they just didn't seem very relevant. And then they did. So I had a boyfriend at 18 who I then reconnect with 27 years later, and he'll come back again in the story. But he and I were traveling in the Sierra for 2 weeks before I went to college, and we had an encounter there that he remembers in vivid detail. And I think I've told you, I've asked him to tell me about that. I mean, I remember him telling me about it the day after. We were camping, and it had to do with the tent, and us being outside the tent. And I remember we woke up the next morning, and he told me about it, and I was like, what? The fascinating thing to me about that event is I can ask him to tell me exactly what happened. I think I probably have multiple times. I know I have multiple times, and I still can't tell you what he told me. It's like the whole thing is blocked, which I find literally completely fascinating because I can't think of any memory that's like that. So then I go on, right? And he comes back into my life 27 years later. So this was 2007 or 8, and he's an abductee, classic abductee. All those experiences, childhood on, grays, and it goes on well into his adulthood. At one point, even with his ex-partner, they had experiences, and at one point she's like, this has to stop, it's scaring me. And I think it did stop after that, although he's had a number of different communications, and he does things in the spiritual arena professionally, so he's fairly open. But even he would tell us that while I don't think he would ever not want it, it hasn't always been the easiest relationship, just because it has made so many ripples in his life. Because he was interested, and because we had all these books out on it, and I was, as again, an academic, and I was raising both, all of our children. We had 5 together, and life was full. And he'd come into the room having just read or watched or listened to something, and he'd be flying. You could just see it and feel it. And I would listen, and it was fascinating. But he'd say, he'd get frustrated with me. He's like, "Why aren't you more interested?" And I said to him, "It's not relevant right now." I'll never forget that. And then in about 2012, I go to a conference in Toronto, and I'm driving home because I could drive from where I lived in New York State. And I am aware that there are ships nearby. I don't know how I know. I couldn't see them with my eyes. I'm like, wow, they're here. And there was a connection. Can't tell you what it was, but I was very aware of their presence. I'd had a Kundalini awakening in 2007 and 2008, and that had started all the practices that we've talked about before. And I think that was part of it. In retrospect, I'm like, it's all coming together, right? All these streams are starting to come together. And at this point, I'm like, okay, I think it's starting to be relevant, but I don't know how. And life is full. I go on. And then in 2014, I'm in the car listening to NPR report. Something comes on about UFOs. And I definitely felt like it's coming. And there's a thought in my mind. It just popped in my mind. It said disclosure within 10 years. That was some title of the thought. And I'm like, okay, that was what my response was. And I start to pay a little more attention in my still busy life. And then 2017, everybody knows what happened there when Lou comes out and all the articles start to drop. And I don't know about the rest of you. I know some of you probably will resonate with this because Darren and I both have talked to enough people now to know that something was going on 2017, 2018, and between that and like 2022. And there's just a lot of growing awareness of this topic and the sense that it's important. And in 2018, all sorts of stuff started coming in about this time and what's happening here. And I may come up again a little bit later, so I won't go into it now. But in 2020, right before COVID started, I was in meditation and got a bunch of information. And I remember coming out of meditation and thinking the entire reason I'm here on the planet starts right now. It's 2020 and the world will never be the same. And then when COVID hit like a month later, I'm like, wow, it went fast. And I think I felt a little bit odd when I was talking to the people in my life, my children and others. I'm like, we're not going back. There is no return to normal after this. This is the beginning of a massive passage. And I knew the UAP component was going to be really, really important because it was the pathway by which a lot of the public would come to awareness about consciousness. And consciousness, why consciousness? Because it is also going to dovetail, it already is, with deeper understandings of the substructures of reality. Reality is not what our material beliefs make it seem. It's so much more. And I knew that this would be the tangible physical path that a lot of people would take to understand, and that this path was really, really crucial for humanity, and that I was here to participate in it. I started looking for people. I started looking for you and the others at that point. So I'll stop there. I mean, we've talked about it for hours and hours and hours. We're trying to encapsulate it, but that's where they really came together for me. It is happening. There is, as you know, we'll get into a little bit later, lots of stuff happening in this arena, and there are, in fact, more and more people being attracted to the UAP phenomenon issue and then segueing into the consciousness piece. You see that a lot, I think, probably with the people you work with, yeah?
Absolutely. And I'm reflecting on some of what you said there as I get prepared here to talk about my own experience with UAP personally. But one of the things I think about is this uncanny way that this has been the entry point for so many people to deeper questions about reality and the nature of existence and all these kinds of things. And this is where I think Jacques Vallée and his work is helpful. There's some times where I think we've gone too far in assuming that all these beings that people have encountered across history are just the same beings that we're just understanding differently. I think we sometimes go too far with that argument. But I do think that something Vallée is onto here is that sometimes this phenomenon or different aspects of it may deliberately cloak itself in different guises, knowing that it will encourage us to interact with it and ask these deeper questions. So at a certain point in human history, that might have been fairies roaming across the land, beings that come out of caves and things like that. At a previous time, it might have been a celestial being in the sky that was coming from the divine realm, from heaven or something. And in our modern time, we seem particularly prepared to engage with this notion of sophisticated intelligence from outside of Earth. So as we are a pioneering species and we basically explored much of the planet, although of course we all recognize, considering 2/3 of the planet is water, there's still much we haven't explored. But at least in our notion, we have the sense that space, outer space, is the final frontier. In fact, that's kind of the opening to Star Trek, right? And so we are open in a unique way to new information, new revelations coming from that particular domain. And so that might partly be why it positions itself as it does. Because what's interesting, and this again will be confusing to some people who might ask the question, well, a fairy is a fairy and a god's a god. What does an ET have to do with each of those? But the point is that once you get beyond that surface veneer, there's a lot of crossover and interesting questions arise. And talking about things coming from just other parts of a physical universe is just one way of asking a question. And some of the data itself seems to prompt deeper questions around, are there different realms of existence? And perhaps our modern way of thinking about these things is too limited. And it's basically forcing us to open our minds, to open our perspectives because the data does not fit, because the data is anomalous. That's what I would say about the overarching perspective and why this is a unique avenue that people come in from when they enter into deeper consciousness studies via UAP. But I want to reflect a bit on my own experience. First thing I would say is that, again, like I said a few minutes ago, in retrospect, you start recognizing that there were signs all along, but you sometimes don't see it till later. So one of the things I was fascinated by in the latter part of high school was Whitley Strieber's books. I was just gobbling up everything he had written on the topic, and he'd written numerous books at that point. And I remember my friends being kind of flabbergasted by how insanely interested I was in the topic, and I was just always mentioning it. We would go on trips to our parents' cabins and things like that in Washington State, and a light would come on top of the mountain, and I would assume that it's an alien craft. There was one time where we were sitting in a cabin, and a wind gust blew open the front door, and it was an interesting sociological experiment because everyone was terrified about being a different thing. One of the women thought it was an axe murderer, somebody else thought it was a bear, somebody else thought it was a cougar. I, of course, thought it was the gray aliens that were about to come in through the front door. So in retrospect, I think I was unusually and atypically interested in this topic. And I think that points to influence, I would suggest. And as I've discussed on different podcast episodes, and I think back to my conversation I had with Mike Masters when I was in Montana earlier this summer, where we both looked back and recognized that certain decisions, quote unquote, that we thought we were making, in retrospect, feel like they were influenced by some sort of overarching intelligence. That's the first thing I would say, is that I just had an unusual degree of interest in this topic. And then one of the key turning points for me, which I didn't initially assume was connected to the UFO phenomenon, and I won't go into in too much detail because people have heard me talk about it elsewhere on numerous occasions, but it was the experience in the hotel in 2005 when my wife at the time and myself woke up in the early morning hours to find a humanoid female entity at the end of our bed, which proceeded to go through the wall, then come back through the wall, then walk down the hallway and out the front door. This was at a time when my wife at the time was pregnant with our son, and our 3-year-old daughter was in the bed beside us. And that was my first breaking out into understanding that reality is not what had been described to me, that these things can happen. This is not just lore from ancient human history where they didn't know any better and they had no scientific understanding. I saw this being pass through the wall, and my wife at the time saw it as well, which of course is hugely affirming, because then you realize I'm not going crazy. It's not just me. We have 2 of us here. We're not having a shared delusion, highly unlikely. If that hadn't happened, I probably would have questioned the entire thing the next day. So that was a big turning point, just to open the aperture to realize, things happen that are claimed to not be possible to happen. And that forever changes what you have your eyes open for. Later on, I had experiences where we were, again, my wife at the time and I were driving, and we'd be taking pictures of different locations where we'd be driving up a mountainside or something. And then only after the fact, when we looked really closely in the sky of those pictures, we would see things in the sky that even when you zoomed in, didn't seem like aircraft, didn't seem like birds. The term I might use now is orbs. Of course, that was not part of our lexicon then. And we just noticed these things. And it was interesting because they always seemed to be in the part of the sky we just happened to be capturing in these photos, which then that kind of prompts the question, are we being directed to take a photo in such a way that that would end up in the photo, but we would only discover it after the fact? Again, raises really fascinating questions about our perception, about consciousness, that kind of thing. I'll just share one other one. It was much later on, and when I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, which is prior to where I live now, which is further west, and there was a time where I was at home with my wife at the time and our son, and our daughter was out somewhere else. She was driving at that point, and there was this huge thunderstorm that seemed to come over, but there wasn't thunder and lightning. It just seemed what sounded like really intense rain, although it's strange because it came out of nowhere, and I don't think it was in the forecast, but it was not unusual to have heavy rain in Western North Carolina, so I didn't think too much about it. But it was really intense, it was consistent, and there was also a deep hum that felt like it was right over top of the house, which was very, very strange. Now, what's even stranger is none of us discussed it. We kind of walked around doing our usual things and didn't discuss it, which again, in retrospect, that's not logical behavior. If you're noticing this intense rainstorm and that's what sounds like a semi-mechanical hum right over top of your house, you would want to know what that is. None of us went to look. We talked about it afterwards. Now, a few minutes later, the sound completely went away. And then my daughter came home. She came inside and we said, "Whoa, did you drive home in that rainstorm?" And she said, "What rainstorm? There was no rainstorm. It's not raining. It's perfectly clear out." So that was even more perplexing to us. And then the next day we were on a walk on a trail nearby, and we ran into our next door neighbor. We had a conversation, and she said, "Hey, did you hear that crazy sound last night?" And we were like, "Yes, we did." And then she said, "My first thought was UFO," which was really interesting because she had no idea that I was interested in this topic. At that point, I had just begun the Point of Convergence podcast. What was also fascinating was her husband did not hear anything, and he was lying right next to her when she heard this incredibly intense volume, and he was surprised that she didn't bring it up. But just like us, we didn't talk about it till after the fact. One last piece to tie in that has this consciousness connection is when we thought back to it, it turns out that my wife and I and my son were a few minutes before then upstairs using a shamanic drum, a mother drum, to basically invite positive contact with benevolent entities. So almost like a form of CE5 blending with like a shamanic journey. And we didn't even connect after the fact that this intense, what sounded like rainstorm and a mechanical hum right above the house, it was incredibly loud, might have been the response to this thing that we had actually initiated. So this is an example of the kind of things that don't just open your mind to the possibility that sophisticated, non-human, technologically advanced creatures are coming from other planets, but somehow other realms of existence and whatnot are involved here.
Yeah, you're making me think of a couple of experiences I didn't think about. First time I had a really deep meditation, the 2010 or something like that, I had the most vivid image of a mantis. It was like a mantis being right in front of me. It was so wild and so cool. And it does really invite this next piece, which is, I think, this question we were going to move to next is, where does the UAP NHI conversation need to expand from where it is in conventional circles in order to address the depth and breadth of what's involved? But do you want to get us started on that?
Yeah, this is a big one. So what we want to try to address here is we all acknowledge that there has been movement. Like Janice said, beginning in 2017, we are seeing this steady progression towards some sort of either confirmation or disclosure, basically saying from some official capacity that we are not alone, that there's other kinds of sophisticated intelligence, not just in the cosmos, but in our very midst that have been here and interacting with us and whatnot. So that still very much is a conversation that involves technology, the notion of cosmic travelers, that kind of thing, but it's not opening up all these other aspects we're talking about. And just to tie this to what we began this conversation with, it's so fascinating to me to even people that I'm now connected to in terms of colleagues and friends and whatnot, who a couple of years ago would have described themselves as atheists and physicalists, assuming that when you die, your body dissolves into the ground, you are nothing more than what was constituted for a short period of time in sort of a fluke of conscious experience, and once that dissolves, there's nothing to you. And they assumed there was nothing meaningful about life. It basically was just enjoy it while you can, and then it's all gone. They believed that physical structures gave birth to this brief flurry we call consciousness, but there was ultimately no meaning to it. There's no meaning in life in general and reality in general. And it was because of experiences with this phenomenon, as we call it, that they began to ask these bigger questions. They couldn't help but ask these bigger questions. And now almost all of them would say that they describe themselves as believing in some sort of supreme power. It's a power that animates all of us. This is connected to the consciousness piece. This is connected to the sense that source consciousness is basically alive in all of us, that we are all mirroring each other to some degree. And it has put these people in touch with, again, this much deeper resonance about meaning. Just yesterday, I heard from someone who was saying that even prior to having experiences with the beings, she had an experience on ayahuasca where she suddenly remembered a time prior to when she came into this incarnation and actually deciding that certain experiences would be set up so as to give her the opportunity to transmute energy, to grow in those kinds of things. And again, this is someone who 2 years ago would have described themselves as an atheist and a physicalist, is an academic still today. And yet because of these experiences, both with the beings and through these non-ordinary states, through these other kind of contact modalities, that she's been able to basically expand herself into this much larger reality. So the question, again, comes down to how do we go from the conversation that's beginning to be had in government around the fact that we do seem to be in the presence of these other kinds of beings that have sophisticated technology to asking the bigger questions. So that's some of the things I think about, Janice, is that this opens up questions about our history, who we truly are, those kinds of things. There's a lot I could jump into here, but I want to pass it on to you first to get some of your reflections on how this conversation needs to expand to do justice to the potential that's really on the table.
Yeah, thanks. It is such a great question. And, I think we talked about this, and I know I've touched on it even earlier in this episode, that for me, there's a lot of things that intersect here, and I know it feels like a lot of information comes through this pathway about this time. So I know it's really central, but in some ways, you don't have to go very far into the UAP topic to get to consciousness, because the point at which people can accept that it's a real phenomenon, and they start to look at, Elizondo's 5 observables, which describe how craft move in ways that defy physics as we know it. That alone, and that's usually like step number 1 for a lot of people once you entertain the idea that it's real, opens the door to consciousness laying the groundwork for the idea that we don't understand reality. We don't understand physics. We understand one layer of it. There's a whole set of layers about physics and the universe and what we're in and how this works that we clearly do not understand. For me, it's very exciting. I'm like, okay, great. Once people start to ask that question, that's great. That's a good question because that leads right down here eventually. We both have examples, especially you, given all the people that you talk to and around, of people who end up in the consciousness living room because they started off with the craft and the material nuts and bolts. So that's happening, and I feel like that just is going to continue happening. I have to say, I do feel like mucking around in all of this is more of the point. You know, the wow factor is part of the lore. We're just supposed to be amazed and in awe. And it feels like there used to be a flare here and there, and now it's not quite the grand finale yet, but it's like there's things exploding above our heads that we all are just going, what on earth is that? I think that's kind of the point. And it feels like that's happening. You know, just we're supposed to be confused. I think we're a long way away from being able to accurately articulate anything other than we don't understand much. To understand ourselves as learners, as youngins, really, it seems to be, to me, exactly what we should be doing right now, and that's what's happening. And then the other piece, and, you know, I know we both know there's a groundswell around education at this point. It feels like there's a lot of key people and key institutions either coming into existence or like the UAP Disclosure Fund, which just got established not very long ago, but then you got New Paradigm Institute and Bigger University and Soul Foundation, all these organizations coming into existence and then really doing massive pushes around education and advocacy because it's just time. And that feels right. And if I can see in my world, because of the education work that I'm doing with the little groups that I work with, I know that we're all feeling like this is a time where we can be bold and start to just, you know, at a cocktail party or at a barbecue or at your aunt's house. I found myself having conversations with people about this where words are coming out of my mouth. This happened just 2 days ago. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm talking about this to this person. But there's a part of me that's like, it's exactly what needs to be happening, because being able to say, look, I'm a normal, intelligent, sane human who has no doubt anymore at all that this is real. And it's time for us to know, because we need to know, because something's coming, things are coming, things are happening. It's not just that it's an intellectual interest, but it's important. I can feel that in my educator bones. I'm an educator and a change agent first and foremost, but I'm careful usually about what I say. So those are the areas that I feel like we really do need to be pushing, and that is happening. I also do think, though, that it really shouldn't go too fast. I know there are, you know, some in our community that really, they want disclosure, they want it all right now. They want to understand everything right now. I get the impulse, but because of the consciousness piece and because of my instinctive understanding of energy and awareness and how it works, and I'm a mental health person, right? I've watched this, and I know you've seen it too. When they get too much too fast, you can really lose grounding. And the people do and have literally gone kind of crazy. I always want to say, it's okay. We're doing fine. This is a good pace, because and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. It seems to me, my experience has been that even conceptually touching it, even just sitting in your living room saying, wow, I wonder if it's real, and allowing yourself to kind of drift there, starts the expansion process. It's a little bit like the hitchhiker effect. It's just a little bit like you just said, I'm kind of interested, and something said, okay, and it starts. I don't think we have to have material exposure in order to begin having the experience. And I don't remember who it was who said it, but somewhere along the way in the past few years, somebody said it was their understanding that disclosure would be happening at the individual level first, through dreams, through experiences, through contact experiences, through seeing things in exactly the way that we each needed it in order to be introduced. And it wasn't going to be shoved down anybody's throats. That's not really what it's about. But my very deep felt sensibility is it's all in our best interest. We are being invited to grow and expand as a species. And it's time for us to be able to learn about what we don't remember while we're in this body, where we came from, where humans came from, all that stuff. And that we're being supported in that. I don't ever feel like we're not being supported. But I know that there are people who have really hard experiences, so I don't want to negate those at all. Anyway, I'll stop and pass it to you.
Yeah, some great thoughts there. And when you were reflecting on how people have that sense of curiosity come online. I was remembering the look that I saw on the faces of the Congress people when David Grush gave his testimony. And that was a remarkable moment in human history and a remarkable moment for this topic, that someone was giving sworn testimony in front of Congress about this notion that not only had there been interactions with these beings, but they had at times crashed their craft. We've recovered these craft, recovered what he called biologics, which is basically another way of saying deceased bodies of these beings. And we apparently have both of these, the craft and the bodies. That was fascinating because that was one of the few topics where I saw this bipartisan curiosity come online. And what I actually saw more than anything else was a sense of wonder. People began to ask themselves questions that they perhaps had not asked since they were young children. So it immediately, like you say, it changes your orientation with life a little bit. Rather than being doubled down on this physicalist mindset that we have pretty much everything figured out and you're just in your usual waking state, 40-hour-a-week life. Instead, you were asking some of the big questions. You were opening your mind to possibilities like we did when we were children. And that was fascinating to see. The other thing I'd say is that I agree with you that what I see happening is very much a grassroots effort. So in some ways, the official disclosure movement is running in parallel and a little bit behind, I would say, what is actually happening at a grassroots level, that we're seeing telepathic contact happen at a much higher rate than used to be the case. In my circles, I'm hearing about this everywhere, people having telepathic contact that have never had it before, and the people who are receiving it that have had it before are getting it at a much higher intensity than they have before, more and more information coming through. So it all seems like preparation being done prior to some major event, which will help us get to the next question in a moment. But the last piece I want to touch on in terms of what needs to evolve in this conversation in the conventional level is we need to hear from experiencers. Because the irony is, we're asking these questions, could it really be that there are non-human intelligences of a sophisticated nature in our midst? I wonder what they want. And we're acting as if we have no clue. And yet you and I both know that we have decades and decades of experiencer testimony, an entire historical lore that has been built up that is remarkably self-consistent, meaning that people from different walks of life that had no prior interest to this topic encountered these kinds of intelligences and not only had similar experiences involving things like, for instance, the abduction and hybridization program where they were taken from their homes where beings passed through walls, just like what happened to me. People were levitated up to craft. Genetic material was taken so that hybrid beings, they're part gray alien, part human, that kind of thing, have been created through this kind of process. This is part of what's been going on in our midst over the last couple centuries, especially towards the end of the 20th century into the 21st. This is something we're going to have to discuss. Right now, it's just a bridge too far for most people. You sometimes will hear people tangentially mention, and we had that whole abduction thing or hybridization thing, but they don't really want to go there. It's a bridge too far. But we do need to go there because these beings are not just here on their own curiosity mission as a scientific expedition like in Star Trek. They seem to be conducting a very vast enterprise, at least some of them, that's connected not only to their future, but to our future. So this is a fundamental question of our time. The other thing I'd say, too, that ties back into the consciousness piece is that one of the reasons why there's new interest and new juice behind this non-dual understanding of reality that we found in these Eastern traditions is that this is the very messages these beings are provided. These beings from supposedly other star systems and other sort of parallel realities are saying some of the same things that these ancient Eastern traditions were saying, that we are all fractal impressions of source consciousness, that human beings have forgotten who we truly are, and that has put us out of alignment with ourselves, with each other, with the larger cosmic community. On it goes. And so they are here to help remind us of that. And that's as much them serving as a kind of spiritual messenger, like an angel, you might call it, as it is them serving as an extraterrestrial who's more like an older brother or sister trying to catch us up on things. So while it's also, on the one hand, the promise of all this new technology, zero-point energy, the possibility to resolve climate change in really novel ways, it's also a return to a former understanding of who we are, that ultimately every sentient being in the cosmos kind of shares as part of our inheritance. So that's fascinating to me, and that's something that has to happen. We eventually need to let all of these experiencers, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even more, around the planet be able to chime in to share with the rest of the population about what these beings are saying, because they have been saying things, and they've been saying things pretty consistently for decades and decades. All right, so that takes us to our next question, which is, how might UAP be connected to this monumental moment we are fast approaching? What do you think, Janice?
Oh, it's one of my very favorite questions, Darren. This is what drove me out and drove me in and drove us together. So, and I told you, in 2017, 18, there were a set of events that happened. They were all quiet. I mean, it was just in meditation. It was in walks. I know people talk about it as downloads. I don't experience it as downloads. It's more like some key goes in a lock inside me and I get access to something that I already knew. But in this case, it was like a big room with a bunch of stuff in there. And there was a whole bunch of stuff. I remember this one day, I'm like, oh my God, I get to be here. Oh my God, I get to be here. I get to be here. I get to be here in a body for this time. Holy cow, this is so exciting. I felt gratitude and amazement for about 3 months. And then I'm like, this is scary. Because what became clear is that we are, take it or leave it, listeners, but was my experience. Like, there are these rivers of forces and phenomena and experiences that are massively disruptive and impactful. I mean, we talked a little bit about this in episode 3, like climate change, geopolitical tension. There are signals from all sorts of end time stories happening now. Everybody can point to one or another. Stuff going on here in the States that is a little concerning, right? As we go into this election year, AI and technology. Anyway, there's a huge list of things that are massively disruptive, and I could see them all converging on the same timeline. And as somebody whose job it has been to track trends, I was like, it's unmistakable. And the first thing, of course, I wanted to go do is talk to people about it. And I think one of the hardest experiences I've had in the past 8 years is just encountering the denial. First, I thought it was just like they're not interested. And then later I was like, no, it's not interest. They're actively avoiding seeing it, which, I have compassion, but I was like, I need people to talk to. There are other people who are seeing this too. The UAP component is a disruptive force, obviously, but it's also a steadying force. The way it appeared to me when I was seeing it all and things were coming in is like, it's absolutely time. That's why suddenly it was like, okay, it's relevant now. Now you can start really digging in and spending hours and hours and hours. I mean, anybody who gets sucked into this topic knows exactly what that's like. It's like yet another book, or listening to another podcast, or sitting in meditation and receiving stuff. I started to notice that I'm a mental health professional, so I was noticing trends in that, higher levels of ADHD, higher levels of anxiety. Probably all of us have experiences of ourselves and people in our lives that are just inexplicably disengaged in material or professional pursuits. The things that used to drive them, that they just don't want anymore. They're kind of perplexed. I smile and say, ooh, this is good for me. It's a signal that original scene was clear. And the UAP component is the place where I think a lot of the invitation is being issued from. I feel like it is as though they're saying, we are being told, humanity, you have a chance to evolve. And there are forces here that will help you do that. And I know there are people who would disagree with that and don't experience the UAP phenomenon as a positive one. But for me, it's not positive or negative. It's really an invitation for us to see, understand, remember, and grow more. But, anybody who's gone through lots of growth in your life knows that that's not always a fun, easy process. So I think that's where it comes in. I mean, if I were not seeing the UAP phenomenon, if I was just a materialist and I was only looking on the surface and I wasn't looking at that, I can understand why people wouldn't want to look at it, because it really is truly only terrifying, right? I mean, there's nothing that we have going on that looks good. But when I add that element along with some of the other scientific advancements, then suddenly the picture looks really, really different. And that goes back to that earlier question we were talking about. Like, part of the reason I want to expand people's awareness of it is because I want to give them hope. And I think we're going to do best as a population if we can begin to acknowledge that we are living in highly disruptive times that are really scary, but we need to begin to start grappling with that as we can and looking at the full spectrum, including what the UAP phenomenon suggests is truer about what's happening, what we are, and what's possible.
Yeah, a lot of the similar points come to me as well. I've been saying for a while now that somehow this is all connected, that on the one hand, as you just pointed to, we have these numerous extinction level threats online at the same time. And rather than us sort of rise to the challenge and really come together as a global tribe and begin to dialogue about these things, instead, many, many people are burying their heads in the sand, either because they've been distracted or because they feel overwhelmed already. They don't feel like they have the psychological capacity or resources to deal with these kinds of things. They have enough to deal with in their own lives. Like you said, many people feel a lot more anxiety than used to be the case. We have these different issues that people are dealing with that they have never dealt with before, and they're all happening at the same time. And I agree with you that when you look at those just as the list of the daunting challenges, it could be so overwhelming that some people might just choose to disengage altogether, or just to follow certain frivolous pursuits and eat, drink, and be merry because the end is nigh kind of thing. But yes, I agree that I think UAP and this consciousness connection wrapped up with UAP is the X factor in the equation. Absolutely. And that's where I draw a lot of solace and inspiration, actually. And I know that you and I would both say that our own lives have led to this moment specifically. That's true for all of us, but we can also trace in each of our individual lives that it takes us right to this really consequential moment. And that tells me that we are not alone in the process. We know that in our own experiences with some of these other intelligences, but also when I look back at the trail, I realize it has been led all along, and that is leading us to where we are now. So that makes me want to tune in more. It makes me want to pay attention. It makes me want to make sure I'm fully online. It makes me want to increase my capacity to work with energy, to transmute energy. You and I have talked many times privately about a big part of this time will be about learning to deal with and transmute really intense energy like we've never experienced before. But we can rise to that challenge. We can do it. And I think we have help in teaching us how to do that as well. And then as we learn it, we can help each other. The other thing I'd say too is that, speaking of messages from the beings, many of them say that this is an opportunity for humanity to wake up as a collective, that we must rise to the challenge. We recently talked about balancing the masculine and the feminine, the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And even experiencers like Chris Bledsoe were told that by the lady, right? That if humankind didn't begin to recognize and honor the divine feminine, it was going to mean bad news for us. So it's not just us saying this. We're having these celestial beings appear and give these same kind of messages. But that means we have an opportunity, but it's also an opportunity that could be missed if we don't pay attention. So I would just encourage all of us to rise to the challenge, to recognize that we're not alone in this, that there are beings that are trying to assist us, that this is more a moment about a monumental transition rather than something about the end of something. And this, of course, is also reflected in some of our ancient traditions that also saw this very moment that's arising now. So to me, that's really what we want to take from this. We want to absolutely pivot from UAP to the consciousness question to the potential that's online in our time. And that pretty much brings us to the end of this episode. I just want to turn it to you, Janice, for any final thoughts before we close.
Thanks, Darren. You touched on something that is really important for me, which is that one of the pieces of information that came through really clearly is that one of the things that makes this time unique, besides the converging forces, is that this is happening at the collective level, not just at the individual level. I think you could always incarnate on Earth and have an awakening experience, but it's a little more like caterpillar turning into a butterfly, where we're all experiencing the metamorphosis together, which makes it incredibly powerful and incredibly fun in those moments where, you're not running a huge amount of energy and just trying to hang on. We need to be assisting and supporting each other. I can't think of a more important time for us to reach out to other people and just check in. How you doing? How can I support you? Getting support, just connecting. This isn't a time to go in and be alone and to not share it, because it really is a collective experience, and we'll have an easier time managing the energy. And as the discourse gets more normative, that'll be a more natural thing for a lot of people to do.
And on that note, we would really appreciate if people would share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. And that's going to bring us to a close of this particular edition of the podcast. We hope you'll join again in 3 weeks' time for Event Horizon.